Well, good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to a special presentation to commemorate today, Holocaust Memorial Day. Welcome to you wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. And it's always a pleasure to welcome our international viewers. We also have an international speaker this evening. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest Mariette Bermowitz, and I'll introduce Mariette to you in just a moment. A bit of housekeeping first. Please do ask questions. The way to do this is to type whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility, which you'll find on your screen. And as ever, we'll do our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. Let me also draw your attention to the chat facility on your screen. This allows you to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. And finally, we are recording this event and it'll appear on the Milim website at milim.org.uk in the next day or so. There you will find recordings of other past events, as well as details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest. Mariette Bermowitz was born in Brussels in 1938 and is the author of this book, Mindele's Journey, a memoir of a hidden child of the Holocaust. She lost her mother and 4 siblings to the concentration camps, but survived along with her father, later emigrating to the United States. She has had a fascinating life, teaching French in New York City, married to an artist who later achieved fame as Alan Vega's Suicide. And in the mid-70s, she lived in Iran, traveling extensively in the Near East. Mariette currently lives in Brooklyn, from where she joins us. A very warm welcome to you, Mariette. Nice to have you with us.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
Now then, let's start by introducing your mother. Where was she from, and how did she come to be in Belgium?
My mother was born in Łódź, Poland. I don't know how you pronounce it. It's a Lodz or Łódź in Poland. And she came to Belgium because her cousin Janko lived in Belgium. And my father was a widower with three children. And he was looking for a wife. And he was friends with Janko. And Janko contacted his cousin Zisla in Łódź to tell her that she was 36 years old. So she, was a kind of old for unmarried, and so she was told about my father Abraham, who was looking for a wife, and so she sent a picture. They went through the rabbi, and the rabbi sent a picture, and letters were exchanged, and my mother came to Belgium.
And Janko was already there. How come
I don't know how Janko was already married. He had 3 sons. He had married a non-Jewish woman, a Gentile, who came from Limburg, very close to Germany. And they had 3 sons, and I think they were all I think they might have been baptized. I think she insisted on their being, non-Jewish. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and your father was already there. What did he do in Belgium? What was
My
his
father
job?
was a tailor, and he came there. I don't quite know. Maybe in the late 20s, perhaps, or early 30s, and he was married, and he had 3 children. He had Esther, Rebecca, my brother Zalik, and those were 3 children. And he was a tailor, and so he needed to have. They were still young, and he wanted to remarry. And so he connected with Janko, who told him about his cousin Zisla. And so that the story, and Zisla came in 1938 to Belgium, and I was born. She came in February of 1938, and I was born in December of 1938. Not a very good time for Jewish children to be born in Belgium.
No, and obviously you would have been very young at the time the Nazis invaded
Yeah,
Belgium. But
yeah.
what do you remember of that time? Was there a sort of marked change in life?
Yeah, I don't, I have some very, very good memories, but all I could remember was my mother had another child in 1942, in February of 1942. And I do remember being very jealous. And I do remember a lullaby my mother used to sing to me in Polish. And I was 3 years old at the time. But that's all I remember.
But things became increasingly more difficult
Yes, 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 yes.
for the Jews in Belgium.
Of course. I mean, food and what have you, and and Jews, of course, had to wear the star when the Germans came in. And we lived on the sixth floor of this apartment, this house, in a neighborhood that wasn't, that was not. We were not. My father didn't make very much money, so we think we were poor.
Now you escaped.
Well, I tell you, what happened is that we were betrayed. My oldest sister, who was 20, Esther, and Rebecca, who was 19, and brother Zalik must have been, they were all around the same age. They were picked up at work. And this was in the beginning of 1942, or in the summer of 1942. And in November 1942, my mother was still, had the baby and was still in the house on the sixth floor. And I was in the attic. My father had a tailor shop in the attic. And we were, as I said, we were betrayed. So the Germans knew that there was a Jewish family living there on the sixth floor. So they came to pick up my mother and the baby. They didn't know they were a baby, anyway, my mother. And my father, I was in the attic with my father, and he heard stomping of boots. So he made the terrible he had to make a decision, either go down, be with my mother and the baby, or take me away through a skylight on the attic. And that's how we escaped.
And you
And we
say
went,
from that point you didn't see the rest of your family again.
that was it. That was the end. Yes. And I was 3 years old. I turned 4 in December of 1942.
And where did you go? You were out on the
Well,
road.
we took the train, and we took the train, which there was a train running at the end of the street where we lived. It was so unusual when we went back to check things out years and years later. I said, "Oh my God, there's a train, there's a railroad right down there." We hopped on the train, and then we went to Liège where Yankel lived. And we ended up in Yankel's house where other Yankel's oldest son was married to a lovely Jewish girl, and her family was there too. And so I came there with my father. So there were quite a lot of people in the house.
And then you describe how Mina, this is your cousin
Yeah, her name was
Yankel's
Mina.
wife,
Well,
she,
there were a lot of. I'm sorry.
she pushes you out into the cold.
Yes, yes,
Uh,
because there were too many people to feed, and she had gotten very worried and big. And her oldest son had collaborated with. There was a German flag flying outside the house. He had joined the Rexist. It's called the Rexist Party, which was the Nazi party in Belgium. He had joined it. And this was the oldest son, which is so unusual. The youngest son, Max, had joined the underground. They were opposite end of the spectrum.
living in the same house.
Living in the same house in the attic, and there were just too many people to feed, and there were just too much. And I remember I remember being very hungry, and as a child I just ran out of the attic, went downstairs, and Mina was down there, and she was eating, and I asked to eat, and she opened the door and threw me out. And so
And then you end up somewhere else. So
I end up in a
what's this?
convent.
You end up in a convent,
I
but
end up in a convent
yeah.
after that. I don't remember any of it except. And of course, I think my father heard me crying and he came to get me. And as I say, Yankel's oldest son was married to, her name was also Esther. In the book, I call her Sarah, but her name was Esther. She had connections apparently through him, maybe. I don't know. He was arrested. The oldest son, Joseph, was arrested after the war for collaborating with the Nazis. But somehow he must have gotten papers and he knew people. To make a long story short, and I found this out because I did research way afterwards from Sarah, that she knew a priest who had connections to convents outside of Liège, and they were hiding Jewish children. And that's how I ended up in this convent.
So how old were you at this point?
This was November 1942. In December, I turned 4 years old.
Yeah, so you're 4 years old.
4 years
You're in
old.
a convent.
Yeah,
This must have been something of a culture shock. Could you even speak the language?
that's just it. I spoke Yiddish and Polish.
Mm.
And I stayed in that convent for the entire year, 1940, the end of 1942, 1943, for an entire year. And the nuns in the book, I describe how the nun said, "Well, this is impossible. She's not speaking French. We have to teach her French because she speaks Yiddish and she speaks Polish." So, I remember them teaching me French and the lovely how I fell in love, I think, with languages at that so early on because I was already speaking Yiddish and Polish, and here's another language, and I figured the world was just one big language, where I needed to know all these languages.
And did they keep you in one place there, or did you have to move around?
I had my own bedroom. They kept me in the nun's bedroom. That was the safest place for me to be because it was a school, but the children were starting with the first grade and I was too young, so even that age was revelatory of something not right. How come such a young child, with all the other children? So one of the nuns, the mother superior, assigned one of the older students to be my guardian. And in the bedroom there was a big basket, and she had told this young girl who was part of the school. Her name was Lucy, that there were any strangers who came to play hide and seek with me and put me in the basket. And I was to stay in the basket until I was discovered. And that's how I remember that very well, the basket.
And how many sort of parent figures did you have? How many people were involved in looking after you?
Well, in the convent, it was just the nuns
Yeah.
and this Lucy who played with me and who again teaching me French and had me play with the other children. But as soon as there were anybody coming to the convent, there was a guardian at the gate, and he knew how to tell the nuns that they were going to be visitors. And as a matter of fact, he was the one who told the nuns that the Germans were going to come investigate the convent. And she had her siblings, her sisters, who lived in a village in the Ardennes Mountains, came to visit her. And she asked them, "Listen, I have this child and she can't stay here. This is the end of 1943. Could you take her?" And they did. So I ended up with the Mother Superior's siblings, three unmarried women, who took me back to the village where they lived. And that's where I spent the entire war. And they became my family, and they remain my family for the rest of my life.
So how did these nuns respond to the fact you were Jewish? Were they interested in making you into a Catholic, or were they respectful that you were different to them?
Well, I was like an average child. I mean, there were processions. I participated in. I used to love to go to mass because I was a favorite child. As a matter of fact, I was really very spoiled. The nuns loved me, and I loved them, and they would sing to me, and they would. I must have been a very cute little girl because they really loved me, and they would, and I loved, and it wasn't, the chapel was right near the dormitory, so I used to hear the ceremonies and the singing and the smell of the incense, and I was always placed in the front. I felt very special. As a matter of fact, when the nuns introduced me, I didn't understand the cross, of course, but they told me about Jesus, and they told me that Jesus was my relative. I kind of like that, you know. So
Yeah, I mean, presumably they were taking a huge
unbelievable,
risk.
unbelievable.
Were they worried about about
Yes,
being discovered? Yeah.
yes, yes, yes.
Were there any close calls? Were there any?
Well, not in the convent. There was a close call when I went in the village, because when I went to live with the three, they were called Martha and Marie Therese and Marie, three wonderful. Marie was the teacher in the town, and it was very unsafe for unmarried women to live, alone. So they went to live with the priest. And towards the end, 19, this is much later on, 1944. Yeah, at the end, 1944, or 19, I believe it was at the end of 1944, the Germans, we had to, it was the offensive, the Germans came back. They thought they had, Americans thought that they had won. After the landing of the Americans in France, they thought they had won, but they didn't. Germans came back to Belgium at the end of 1944. And the German commandant ended up in this village and went to the priest's house, and he wanted to see everybody who lived in the house. And there we were with this little girl. He said, "Who is this little girl?" And the priest said, "Well, she's an orphan." And the German called me over. He says, "Come here." And he said it in German, and I was kicked because they thought I was going to answer in Yiddish. Kim du is very close to Kim come, to the German. And I went over to him. He went into his pocket and took a candy and gave it to me. So, that was the closest call I think I ever had, except I couldn't, I went right away. I went, the oldest, the Tante Marie put me in her classroom. She was a teacher, but she didn't allow me. They told me not to talk to the other children because they were afraid that they were going to question, where do you come from? Who are you? And so it was very restricted.
And what about the rest of your family? Did you, I mean, presumably you were interested to know what had happened to them. Was there any news about them? Did anybody try to get in touch? Did you try and get in touch with them?
No, because I didn't know I had, my family was these wonderful women who was raising
Mm.
me. I was spoiled to death. I was really the child they didn't have. They were in their 30s, and I was very, very much loved. And what did happen is that my father, towards the end of the war, I don't know how he managed it. He living in the attic, he escaped several times from that attic, and he came with a woman who was there. As a matter of fact, Jacques' oldest son's wife, her mother was living there. Her name was Madame Goldman. And my father became friends with Madame Goldman to the point that after the war, they lived together. But towards the end of the war, at the end of 1944, right before when we had to evacuate, my father showed up with Madame Goldman. I don't know how he did it. I didn't know he was my father. He spoke to me in Yiddish. I didn't understand what he was talking about. And I was crying and I didn't want to go with him. It was very traumatic, but I remember that.
And did you leave with him
No,
or
no,
no?
no. He knew that it was not safe, and he didn't. I don't. But
No.
he took a big, big risk coming to see me. Yes, and he went to the convent. That's how he knew where I was.
Oh, I
I
see.
think the sisters, the nuns, helped him with the guard. The how the keeper, the
Mm.
gatekeeper. Had I don't know how, but they came with him.
How did you discover when the war had finished?
It's very vague to me, but I don't remember. I was when the war ended. I was 6 years old. Uh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't remember that very well, except it was very sad. I remember the sadness because we went to live in a very horrible place. And it was only two rooms, and there were four people there. My father lived there came there with Madame Goldman. It was in Brussels, and Madame Goldman lost. She had six children, and she lost her husband, two children, and she lost part of her family as well. And these people were traumatized. They didn't know where to go. They had no money, and they had lost everything. And so we lived in this hovel. There were two rooms, the four of us. That's all I remember. And I remember the smells and the stench. and it was a very, very narrow street, and I had left. The people loved me, so I didn't know. And as I said, I couldn't speak Yiddish anymore. Madame Goldman spoke French, so at least I had learned French. I was able to speak with her, but she was always crying and very sad and singing very, very, very sad songs. And I remember those songs.
But presumably your identity by this point was quite complicated.
Very complicated. Yeah. But children are incredible. Children are very resilient. I mean, right away, I started school. I went to school and I loved school. I loved school. And my teachers loved me too. And I used to spend, when I got a little bit older, I used to spend my time in the library. I loved the library. And I got to read all the books because the librarian got to know my story. So she was very, she really made sure that I was very, very much paid attention. Yeah.
So you're back with your father. Were
Yes.
you able to maintain contact with the
Yes.
nuns and
Yes.
the family? Yeah.
Yes. Yes. My father, because as I said, my father was very sick. He had tuberculosis, and Madame Goldman, and then Madame Goldman had her son who was mentally challenged. He, as a matter of fact, was saved in an insane asylum in Belgium. That's another story. It's pretty amazing. So my father, who knew how wonderful these people had been, allowed me to go back on every vacation. It was Easter, uh, summer vacation, every vacation. I ended up back in the little town called Fréture. And while I was there, I went to catechism. I learned, I continued my education. When I came back, my father sent me to yeshiva. So but I wasn't a very good student, and the rabbi didn't like me very much, and I didn't like him. And I put thumbtacks on his seat, and he sat down one day on his thumbtacks. Am I thrown out of yeshiva? And I kind of liked that very much.
When did you come to America?
I was 12 years old when I came to America. Yeah, it was very traumatic because, my Belgian family, I mean, living with my father, Madame Goldman, and his son was not a very pleasant experience. They were all, the Jews after the war were just so traumatized. You know, they
And
didn't.
all of them moved to America with you?
No, no,
No.
my father had. I don't know. There was a fight with him and Madame Goldman, what have you. So they separated.
Mm.
She went to live in Brazil, and my father ended up. He had a sister in Brooklyn, New York, whom he hadn't seen for 38 years, and so she said, "Come." And I think it was the fact that he had broken up with Madame Goldman. He didn't know, you know, he had rekindled with his Landsmann, his tailor friends. He had a lot of friends, my father, and he
Mm.
was doing okay after the war, kind of. But anyway, he decided to go to America, to Brooklyn.
And how was that for you compared to how your life had been in Brussels?
Well, as I say, I loved school. I was a very, very good student. And every vacation, I used to go to my country house, as I used to call it, to my tantes. And I didn't want to leave. Madame Goldman sent her daughters to Israel. I didn't want to go to Israel. I had flunked out of yeshiva. I was a so, and I didn't want to go to America.
But you did, and
I did.
and and how
I did.
how was the experience? Was it pleasant, or were you still
No,
unhappy with?
I was very
No.
unhappy, especially
Okay.
that I didn't like my cousins. I didn't like my aunt. I didn't like any of them. They were not the warm, cuddly people who paid attention to me. So, and my aunt had four daughters, and uh, I think there was a lot of competition there. They didn't quite know what to do with me,
Mm.
and yeah.
And was that it with Belgium, or did you keep visiting? Did you
No,
keep visiting the
but what
the,
happened
the
is
nuns?
I kept my I used to call them les tantes, my tantes, They wrote me every other week. They wrote me. I have a stack of letters that I kept,
Wow.
and that's kept what kept me going. And and they said, "You will come back. You will come back, and we will see you again." And those letters really, yeah. And never did they try to convert me. Never,
Mm.
never. I mean, I knew that Jesus was my relative, so I had no problem with that. That I knew. That was a fait accompli. But yeah, no, they kept me emotionally, together, because my father was like in deep despair constantly. He was not happy. He remarried. I didn't like her either. I didn't like a lot of people. I didn't like a lot of people.
But as if your life wasn't complicated and interesting enough,
Yeah.
you met and married a
Oh, yeah.
man who achieved significant fame as an artist and a
Yes.
vocalist. What can you tell us about Alan, and why do you think people are so interested in him still, almost 10 years after he passed away?
Well, because he was not only an artist, he was a musician, he was a Renaissance man, he wrote poetry, photographer, sculptor. And as a matter of fact, I mentioned that to you. Somebody from uh, Leeds Beckett University contacted me, Mr. Matthew Copeland, because he's writing a book about Alan's art. Alan
Wow.
was very much influenced by Ad Reinhardt and Kurt Seligman, who were major artists in their time. And Kurt Seligman became Alan went to Brooklyn College, and he had the access to some of these very, very fabulous teachers. And he was way ahead of his time. I mean, when I met him, I hung out with all the foreign students, of course, and he was very much taken by, he had an Italian friends. He lived in an Italian neighborhood in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, and he was out of the ordinary, and he really was, and he was gorgeous on top of it. So when we met, I think we clicked. It was like I mentioned in the book, there was like he was my salvation at the time. He was just somebody that I really connected with. And he knew, and as soon as he learned of my background, he really connected. And when we married, he did nothing but drawings of horror and over. He was, he was, his mantra was man's inhumanity to man. He was really obsessed by what's going on in the world. He was a visionary. He was very concerned that America was going down the drain, and was the Vietnam War. So we had all of that to contend with. And then he went to a concert of Iggy Pop. I don't know if you've heard of Iggy Pop.
Mm.
That changed his life, and he decided that he became very confrontational with his art and his music, and that's when he really started performing, and music became his art. And so, as I said, but his art is really quite fabulous. He was a sculptor as well, and not only he was also an incredible graphic artist. He did some beautiful drawings. I have quite a lot of his work still, and people are very interested now because he was way ahead of his time.
Mm. But things didn't work out, and you end
They,
up in Iran. How did you how did you end up living in Iran?
well, I had I, the divorce was very, very traumatic for me, very, very traumatic, because I really went, quite in love with Alan Vega suicide. And I don't know. I met this. I went after 2 years. After 2 years of this divorce, I finally decided. A friend of mine invited me to a party, and there was this young guy who had just graduated from medical school, and we hit it off. And he said, "Well, I know I would like to travel." And I'm a Sagittarian, I love to travel. I can't really, I just love it. He says, I've written to the head of the medical school in Shiraz, Iran, and I have a job. Would you like to go with me? I said, yes. So I went. And so I went. I lived in Iran for 2 years, and I think two of the best years of my life.
So this was when? This was obviously
This is
before the
1975. This was the
revolution. Yeah.
Shah. We did the Shah of Iran, and we did. He was teaching in the medical school, and I was teaching. I taught at Pahlavi University. I taught French and English, and it was just miraculous. It was just incredible. We traveled. We had a little car. We traveled. We did all of Iran, and then we traveled when we had vacation. We went up to Nepal. We went to India. We did 6 weeks in Afghanistan. We ended up in Pakistan. I mean, we did a great deal of traveling. Yes.
And did you experience any hostility in any of these places?
Well, one of my students, I knew that I had Savak agents in my classes. A Savak was a secret service in Iran. And by that time, I already had learned how to speak Farsi because, as I said, I think people should speak more than their own language. They should speak at least 5 languages. And so I had learned Farsi, and I was teaching in two different places. The postgraduates, lunchtime between 12 and 2, postgraduate students. And this student in my other class accompanied me to my other class. And we went through a neighborhood, and he said, Jews live here. Jews live here. I said, uh-huh. I said, well, what about? He says, well, we don't like them. And I said, well, I'm Jewish. Well, he almost bent down on his knees because I was, I'm the one giving him his grade. I said, so what, you don't like me? So we had this whole conversation, and he apologized, and I knew then that he was a Slovak agent. Yeah. No, but head of Savak was a Jewish guy. He was Jewish. And
Really?
yes, and he used to play the Santur. He came to our house and he introduced himself. I mean, it was such abnormalities all over the place. But I loved Iran, and I only wore chador, the chador what the women wear in Iran, when I went to visit the mosques. I I like to go visit mosques later.
And when did you leave Iran?
We left in 1977. A year. The revolution was 1979. We left a year before because we knew that something was happening. Yeah,
So things were already
yeah,
becoming
yeah,
unsettled.
yeah. Ed, the man that I was with, that young guy that I was with, I was supposed to marry him too. That's another story. I'm not going to go into it now. But he was tall, blonde, blue eyes, and walking in the street, and something landed, from a bus. Somebody threw something at him, and he said, "I'm not staying here." So we left.
Much of your immediate family perished during the war, but have you managed to find surviving members
Well,
of your family?
yes, I went to, I had a girlfriend who had a sabbatical. She went to Israel. And I remember Madame Goldman's daughters were in Israel. And I found them. I went to Israel, I found them, and they told me that Sarah was in Brazil. Madame Goldman had died by that time.
Mm.
So that's when I started my quest. From Israel, I went to Brazil and I met Sarah, and she told me what happened. All the information that I have is from her when I went back, when I found her in Brazil. Then she told me, that Max is still in Belgium. And I went to Belgium, and I found out that Max was a cousin. And I found, and it's so, what I have to give you, there was a Holocaust museum outside of Belgium in Malines. And when I went there, I left a picture of my family because part of the archive. And last year, somebody contacted me and said, "You are my cousin." I said, "Who are you?" She said, "I contacted the Holocaust Museum in Belgium and we have the same picture. I'm,
Wow.
I'm your cousin." And this cousin led me to you, Jonathan. You're also my cousin.
Yes, so full disclosure, we are second cousins
Removed.
twice removed. And the journey of connecting with you is actually a whole other story, which has involved discovering other cousins and even as recently as 2 or 3 weeks ago, finding yet more cousins in Australia, all on the singular side of the family. So
Yes.
this must have been a big family in Łódź and in Pabianice in Poland, and several members survived, and they're all over the world.
Well, I didn't know that. I really didn't know. And I learned so much from this cousin Rachel in Toronto,
Mm.
whom I'm going to visit when the weather, gets a little warmer. But that my mother had 8 siblings.
8.
8 siblings. Yes, brothers and sisters all over the place. So I mean, I have yet. I mean, this is 80 years later, right, or whatever. I don't, a long, long time that I'm still finding family, and I'm so glad that I connected with you, Jonathan.
It's amazing how these things all lead to other things. And of course, you wouldn't be our guest on the webinar. I suppose I would have never found your book. I'm going to recommend this book. It's actually a really good read.
Thank you.
But you open and close the book with an account of a relationship you're having
Okay.
with a German man called Wilhelm.
Right.
And it seems the experience was perhaps a little uncomfortable. Do you think we can ever really have a normal relationship with German people?
Yes, we can. Yes, and I think Wolfgang came into my life for a reason. I believe there are no coincidences. No coincidence. I mean, no, there. It's all meant to be. And we had a 10-year relationship, and he had. Uh, I went with him to his cousin's wedding, 80th birthday in Germany, and that was a traumatic experience for me because she was her she the big party. You're talking about a very big party, and they were showing a video of her,
Mm.
when she was young, and it, and then 14 years old, she's a brown shirt and she's wearing a swastika. And there I am, with Wolfgang. I'm over 60 years old. I'm saying, what am I doing here? And this is what led me to write this book. And I also with Wolfgang, he had demons. His father uh, was a pretty wealthy man in Germany. He had a diesel factory, and he had slave employees during, the war. And after the war, he was arrested for collaborating, of course, aiding the Nazis. And Wolfgang was born different. I don't know. I think maybe some people are different. They're born with a different kind of heart. And his brother was just the opposite. But Wolfgang, yeah, in the book, I changed the name, but his name is really Wolfgang, was the gentlest, sweetest person ever. And he left Germany because of his father.
Mm.
And he married, when he came, his first wife was Jewish.
Really?
Yes, and he was extremely bright. He wanted to go to his father insisted he go to medical school. He had 1 year medical school and he just couldn't do it. But he was a musician, he played the piano, he was an intellectual. I mean, I really loved this man. And we worked, we went to see a family person to help us talk to each other, and it was incredible. Can we ever love Germans? Well, yes. We have to. It's a very complicated. It's all individual stories, and love cannot be explained except that it comes from an openness to the universe. I don't know how else to. It's like The Little Prince, a book, The Little Prince from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, a book that I absolutely loved. He says, what is essential cannot be seen you know, with your eyes. You can only see it with your heart. So I think if you connect to your heart, if people connect to what it is to be a human being, and that we're all together on this planet for a reason, perhaps there might be a different world. Because right now we're in a pretty bad place.
If any of our audience have a question, now would be a good time to type it into the Q&A. Tell us a little bit about the process of writing this book and how you got it published and how you managed to sort of get it to market, as it were.
Yeah, well, I self-published it because I really needed to have this book out. And I went to lots of classes because I'm not a professional writer, but I became a professional writer. I'm writing other things.
Mm.
And uh, it took me 10 years to write this book. And I met this lovely person in one of my writing classes, and she helped me write the book. And it was the most cathartic thing I have ever done
Mm.
in my life.
So
I
when you
think,
say it took you 10 years, it was 10 years to actually write it, or was it 10 years to hone it and edit it and get it into a
altogether,
yeah,
yes, altogether, and to do the research to find these people. As
yeah.
I said, when I went to Germany, and I saw the swastika and all of that. It was like there are trigger points. You asked me about what do I remember when I was a child, when I was thrown out into the cold. I remember colors. I remember the colors of the swastika, the red and the blue, and I'm sorry, the red and the black. I remember the cold. I remember the sounds. I remember that.
Mm.
It all went into my subconscious, and that all came back when I wrote this book. And I have a very good memory.
Yes, you do. I mean, the amount of detail in the book is tremendous, and the book has recently been translated into French. This is the French version, which you very kindly uh, gave to me. Do you have plans to have it translated into other languages, or perhaps write something further to the first book?
Mm, No, the next book I started writing is about Iran and my relationship with the man I went there with. Yeah, and Iran.
Right.
That was also a very important period of my life because I discovered the world. I discovered Islam. I discovered a world completely different from the world I came from. And at the same time, it made me realize we're all the same. We're humans.
Yeah.
We're humans.
So, with today being Holocaust Memorial Day, what lessons would you want to share? What would you want the current generation, the
Well,
leadership of this generation, and indeed younger people, what would you want them to take on board?
well, I young people should understand what evil is. They do not know what evil is really. They have to be educated. They have to learn. They have to be curious. They have to be told. They have to be told what it was like. And um, on on this very very special day, we are we remember those of us who lived through remember, but those who are listening now who might not even know how evil can be. And this is what we have to let young people understand, and not to be brainwashed by all the gadgets and the internet and all these media that really is destroying so many of our young minds. And the young today have a great responsibility to really see what's going on,
Mm.
because at times like these evil spreads very very quickly.
Do you speak about your life? Are you one of these survivors who goes round to
No,
schools and God,
no,
no,
I let my book.
you let
uh
your book do that?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, you know um yeah, no, I think it has to be remembered. I think it has to be, it has to be, it has to keep remembered. We have to keep it there, and young people definitely have to be part of this awareness that they have a world, that the world is theirs, and they cannot let it be taken over by all the evil forces that exist.
Mm.
And it's in times of financial difficulty that this creeps up and they find scapegoats. Of course, the Jews have always been the scapegoats, and now it's the migrants and what have you. Our world is in bad, bad shape. I'm
Um,
not. I'm not a political person because I'm working from the heart. I can only see, these people who saved me. They, the nuns, I mean, they really took chances, but there are people who rise up to the task of understanding that, we are responsible for each other. We're responsible for the planet. We're responsible for the earth. We're destroying everything.
Presumably the nuns are no longer with
No.
us, but are you in touch with anybody from the
Families,
world?
yes,
Yeah.
yes, 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 yes. And they also contact me via Zoom. And one of the my tante's niece, I used to go visit her in Belgium, and I know her whole family. And yeah,
Wonderful.
I'm a very privileged person, very privileged person.
Now, you've also written a poem which we're going to share with our audience in our email tomorrow, and this is a poem about your father.
Yeah.
Um, how did you come to be writing poetry? Is that something relatively new, or have you been doing it for a long
No,
time?
I always dabbled. I used to dabble. I used to write just words. I didn't even write sentences. I wrote dabble until one day I said, these words, if you put them in sentences, they really have an effect. So I started writing it in French because French is still my language. I love French. I love the language. I love the literature. I have a master's degree in French literature, and I'm so grateful for that too. And so that's how it started. I used to doodle in class, used to write words, and then I did substitute teaching in New York in a very interesting high school, Stuyvesant High School. And Frank McCourt, who wrote Angela's Ashes, was a teacher there. And I once took over his class. And that's where I wrote the poem that you now have. Because I told my students, okay, let's all write a word on the board. Every student had to give me a word, and I gave them a topic, their father. And the whole board came filled with words. It was just the most magnificent, magical thing that ever happened. And they all wrote poems using his words. And I wrote this poem.
Wow. Well, we'll
That's how it
share it
happened.
with everybody tomorrow, and they can
Thank you. Thank you.
they
Thank you.
they can they can. It's a very moving poem, and hopefully they will get something out of it.
Thank you.
Now, Mariette's book is this Mindele's Journey. It's available on Amazon.
Amazon. Yes.
And I think there's a Kindle version as
Yes.
well if people
Yes.
want it. So that's available. Recommended, highly recommended. It's a very personal book, but worth a read. And to thank you for being our guest, I'm going to send you this. This is some of my photographs.
Oh,
Um,
wonderful.
so,
Oh,
so that
wow.
will find its way to you. Might take a
Thank
week or
you.
two to cross the pond, but it will be with you soon. Now, just a few words about our up and coming program before we say goodbye this evening. 3rd of February, we're delighted to welcome back to Milim His Majesty's Government's independent advisor on anti-Semitism. This is Lord Mann, of course, of Holbeck Moor, who will be in conversation with Simon Meyerson KC, chair of the Leeds Jewish Representative Council. And then on the 24th of February, we're delighted to host Maya Arad. Maya is noted as being the foremost Hebrew writer outside of Israel. And I'll be speaking to Maya about the first of her books to be published in English, in English translation. This is called The Hebrew Teacher. On the 17th of March, we've got Keith Khan-Harris. He's also making a welcome return to Milim to tell us about his new book, Everyday Jews, Why the Jewish People Are Not Who You Think They Are. We have much more in the pipeline. Please do visit our website at milim.org.uk for more details. All of our online events are free, but you can make a donation if you want. There's a link in the chat and on our website. So it remains for me to thank our guest, Mariette Bermowitz, once again. Thank you so much, Mariette. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
And looking forward to seeing you all again soon.
I think
Until
so.
then,
I may go visit this professor. He's invited. He's going to interview me,
well,
Professor
you're welcome. If you
Fletcher
want to come to
Copeland.
Leeds, you are more than
I
welcome.
don't know what's going to happen. He's contacting me. He wants me to talk about Alan Vega's suicide.
How fascinating. And the fact he's in Leeds, there has to
Yes,
be a good reason for that.
I
So
told
we look forward to hosting you. We'll run a live event. Looking forward to seeing you all then next time. Stay safe. See you soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a